I'm joined now by two unabashed experts on the way Parliament works. Lieutenant General David Leakey was until recently Black Rod, often called the Queen's representative in Parliament and a man who understands the workings of the House of Lords particularly well, and by Hannah White, former clerk in the Commons, the kind of person who in other circumstances Speaker Bercow might be asking for advice right now. She is now Deputy Director at the Institute of Government. David, can I start with you? This strange word, prorogation, what does it mean, and why is this year different?
Be very clear. Prorogation means the suspension of Parliament and all business and parliamentary business and parliamentary activity for the duration of prorogation. And the key thing is that suspension is a total suspension of parliamentary business as distinct from a recess, when Parliament can continue with the behind-the-scenes activity, the continue of the progress of legislation and the processes.
So it removes all power, all agency from Parliament at a very special time politically.
It does. And typically, prorogation lasts for 3 or 4 days, sometimes 5 days. And critically, it is to enable Parliament to arrange itself for the great theatre of the state opening, for the practical arrangements. So it doesn't need to be longer than a few working days.
So this is why some people out in the streets, as it were, are calling this a coup. Could the Queen have done anything other than assent to Boris Johnson's request?
I don't think the Queen could have done anything else, not since 1708, when Queen Anne declined to give royal assent to a bill, has the monarch taken a political stance on such an issue. And I think this brings into stark focus the role of the Queen and the Queen's relationship with Parliament and her position in the Constitution. And paramount in our Constitution is parliamentary sovereignty. And therefore, I don't think the Queen would want to gainsay what Parliament does.
So this takes us to what Parliament is going to do this coming week, Hannah. Let's just talk through this. Parliament doesn't sit on Monday, comes back on Tuesday, and the plan, as we understand it, is for those who want to stop no deal to take control of the order paper. To do that, they need the support of the Speaker doing something quite unusual, in fact, absolutely unprecedented. That's right.
So what's expected is that they will try to use the emergency debate procedure. And the significant thing about that is normally it is just that. It's a procedure to enable the House of Commons to have a debate. And what they will be asking the Speaker to do in this circumstance is to allow the House to make a decision. And the decision will be to give them control of the order paper on Wednesday.
You know the Speaker a little bit. Do you think he's going to allow them what they want?
Well, I think he will, because Boris Johnson has been bending the conventions in relation to prorogation.
So has Speaker Bercow, presumably.
And I think that Boris Johnson will meet his match in the form of the Speaker Bercow in this sense.
So nobody's breaking the law here, but both sides are going to the edge of conventions and pushing conventions as far as is possible. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that this all happens on Tuesday. That means that those trying to stop no deal, the so-called Remain Alliance, whatever we call them, have 2 days only, I think Wednesday and Thursday, to pass quite complex, possibly, legislation. Is that possible?
It's possible, but it's extremely tight. It's easier in the Commons than it is in the Lords. In the Commons, you can do what's called programming legislation, which means you set out exactly how long there is to debate each stage. The Lords procedure is much more flexible, and there's been discussion about whether members of the House of Lords might try to prolong debates in order to prevent the legislation receiving royal assent before prorogation.
So-called filibustering, talking things out. Again, you know the House of Lords, David Leakey. Is it possible the House of Lords will not have time to get this legislation through anyway?
Well, once again, we come to bending the conventions. There is a process in the House of Lords where the length of speeches given by individual members can be curtailed by the House. The Lord shall no longer be heard, I think is the expression. And it's very, very rarely, if ever, used these days. But it is possible to use that convention to limit the time spent in so-called filibustering.
Hannah, let's jump forward again and assume all of this goes through. Government are absolutely livid with the way the Speaker is behaving on all of this, but with the Speaker's support, it's possible that my next guest and others will be able to get their way. Does Boris Johnson then have to do what he's told?
I would argue that, yes, the government has to follow the law. If this is a law which has been passed by Parliament, which has received royal assent, which it would do in the prorogation ceremony, if not before, then yes, the government would have to follow what Parliament has decided. And I think the question then is how the government reacts and whether it opts to say to the House, actually, in these circumstances, we think we need an election.
That's the ultimate answer, I suppose, David Leahy. But again, this legislation isn't actually the law until it's had the royal assent, the assent of the Queen, which happens at the end of the process. Is it possible for the government to say, well, you may have got all this through the House of Lords, the House of Commons, you may be instructing me to go back and ask for a further delay in Brexit, but we're not going to allow this to have royal assent? Could he do that?
Well, I suppose he could do that, but the convention is that all bills that have passed all processes are given royal assent just before the prorogation is finally announced. And that's part of the ceremony of prorogation in the House of Lords.
Finally, Hannah White, you said that an election was possibly coming, but we have the Fixed Term Parliament Act. That makes it much harder, doesn't it?
It does. So there are two routes now to get an election. One is a vote of no confidence, which triggers a 14-day period in which other people can try to form a government. But what the government would have to try to do in these circumstances, if it wanted to pose the question, is get 2/3 of MPs to vote for that. And then there would be a key question about what the Labour Party did in that circumstance.
Exactly. That means Labour voting for an election. OK, final beastly question to both of you. In your waters, in your instincts, as between Boris Johnson and the rebels, who's going to win this week?
I think it depends what you think people are trying to achieve. So it is possible that the legislation will be made. It is possible that will meet the objectives of people trying to prevent a no-deal exit. But then that might mean that the government calls an election, and in fact that might be what they want.
I agree. I mean, who knows what anyone wants? So I think pick your end state, whether it's a referendum or an election or no deal or no leaving or withdrawal of Article 50. Those are the four, I guess, possible end states that people want, and we'll see which one of those comes out. But I don't think you can bet on it at the moment.
Well, you've both been very lucid. Thanks a lot.